A freezing dawn light breaks over a South Carolina cattle pen. 1,100 British soldiers charge into a silent, waiting line of American militia. Musket fire tears through the morning mist in a rhythmic, thunderous roar. A line of American sharpshooters fires twice, then turns and runs toward the hills. The elite British Legion breaks formation, sensing a desperate, fleeing enemy. They sprint toward a third line of battle, unaware they are running into a slaughterhouse. In less than 60 minutes, the most feared force in the British Army ceases to exist. The broad river churns with the debris of a shattered empire. 110 British soldiers lay dead in the tall grass. 229 men bleed out in the mud, begging for medical aid. 600 survivors drop their weapons and raise their hands in total surrender. Brigadier General Nathanael Morgan stands on a low rise, watching the carnage unfold. He chose this ground deliberately, placing the river at his men's backs. There was no room to run, so the militia stood their ground. Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton's reputation for invincibility died here in the dirt. The British Legion, the swift strike force of the South, was effectively erased. Major General Nathanael Greene had authorized this independent command only weeks earlier. He sought to annoy the enemy and protect the vulnerable backcountry population. He did not know he had just baited the British into a strategic trap. The destruction of the Legion stripped the British commander, Cornwallis, of his eyes and ears. Without his light infantry, the British Army lost its ability to conduct rapid reconnaissance. The battlefield at Cowpens remained silent, littered with the remnants of a failed campaign. Morgan's men held the field, having suffered only 72 casualties in the entire engagement. The tactical gamble of the three-line formation had paid off with absolute mathematical precision. The British myth of total dominance in the South began to crumble under the winter sun. Cornwallis would soon receive the news, and with it, the realization that his strategy was failing. The path from the Cowpens led directly to the burning of the British baggage train. The entire southern theater of the war shifted in that single bloody hour. A quill scratches across parchment in a dimly lit tent. Major General Nathanael Greene signs a dispatch dated December 16, 1780. He maps out the divided American forces across the South Carolina landscape. The ink dries on a plan designed to stretch the British thin. He commands Brigadier General Nathanael Morgan to move into the backcountry. The order grants Morgan the authority to operate as an independent detachment. His mission is to annoy the enemy and shield the local population. The document sits in a leather satchel carried by a lone rider. Morgan receives the instructions and shifts his men toward the broad river. He occupies a strategic position near a known cattle grazing site. The movement forces British intelligence to track a phantom army. Cornwallis studies the reports of American activity in the western regions. He views the split in the Continental forces as a tactical error. He dispatches Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton to force a decisive engagement. The British Legion marches with orders to crush the smaller American force. The trap begins to take shape across the rolling South Carolina hills. Greene's gamble relies on the predictable aggression of the British commander. Tarleton moves rapidly, driven by the prospect of an easy victory. The correspondence between the two American generals survives in the archives. It reveals a calculated maneuver rather than a stroke of luck. Morgan waits at the Cowpens with the terrain already clear in his mind. He designs a defense that accounts for the speed of the British cavalry. The backcountry wilderness becomes a chessboard for the two armies. The stage is set for a confrontation that will test the American strategy. What will happen when the British commander realizes the trap is closed? A map lies spread across a heavy oak table in a British command tent. The headquarters of Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis sits near the border of the Carolinas. Red ink marks the projected locations of Continental forces across the backcountry. Cornwallis studies the reports of American movements in the western regions. He identifies the split in the Continental Army as a critical weakness. The British command views the detachment of Nathanael Morgan as an isolated threat. Scouts report that Morgan's men are poorly provisioned and lack deep support. Cornwallis underestimates the depth of the American position in the hills. He assumes a swift strike will scatter the militia and secure the region. The general selects his most aggressive subordinate to execute the pursuit. Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton receives the order to track the Americans. The British Legion prepares to move with a force of 1,100 men. Tarleton marches his troops through the dark woods on January 16, 1781. His men navigate the rugged terrain of the South Carolina backcountry under moonlight. They move with haste to close the distance before dawn breaks. The British soldiers carry heavy equipment on a forced march. Tarleton expects a disorganized retreat rather than a prepared defensive front. His intelligence report suggests the Americans are crossing the broad river in panic. The British commander ignores the warnings regarding the physical fatigue of his infantry. He relies on the reputation of his cavalry to shatter any resistance. The column reaches the vicinity of the Cowpens after midnight. Tarleton orders his men to maintain their pace through the night. He chooses to engage immediately upon locating the American camp. The British soldiers arrive at the edge of the clearing at first light. Tarleton does not wait for his main infantry force to catch up. He commits his entire unit to a rapid frontal assault. The British commander views the engagement as a simple mop-up operation. He remains unaware that his scouts have been fed false information. The lack of coordination with the main British army leaves Tarleton isolated. His arrogance blinds him to the tactical reality of the open field. The British Legion forms into lines under the cold morning sky. Tarleton draws his sword and signals the advance toward the rise. The trap is set as the British troops march into the silent clearing. The morning fog clings to the tall grass of the Cowpens clearing. Brigadier General Daniel Morgan stands on a slight rise near the broad river. He surveys the ground where he placed his men in 3 distinct lines. The first line consists of 150 sharpshooters under Andrew Pickens. They kneel in the grass, with rifles aimed at the dark tree line. The second line sits 150 yards behind the first. 300 militia members hold their muskets in a steady, waiting stance. The third line waits behind a ridge, hidden from the view of the approaching British. 400 Continental regulars under John Eager Howard stand in disciplined rows. Morgan positions these troops with the broad river directly at their backs. This choice eliminates any possibility of a disorganized retreat for his soldiers. The British Legion emerges from the woods in a chaotic, rapid advance. Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton orders his cavalry to charge the sharpshooters. The first line fires 2 precise volleys into the ranks of the British horsemen. Bullets strike the advancing riders and force the cavalry to recoil in shock. Pickens signals his men to retreat behind the second line of militia. Tarleton interprets the withdrawal as a total collapse of the American center. He commands his infantry to abandon their formation and pursue the fleeing marksmen. The British soldiers run forward with bayonets fixed and ranks broken. They reach the second line of militia under the heavy pressure of the charge. The militia delivers a volley before falling back toward the Continental regulars. The British infantry cheers, believing the entire American force is routing in panic. They accelerate their pace to finish the pursuit before the Americans reach the river. The British line becomes ragged and disjointed across the uneven terrain. The troops crest the small ridge and run directly into the third line. John Eager Howard orders his Continental regulars to stand their ground. They fire a coordinated volley that stops the British momentum in its tracks. The British soldiers stumble under the sudden, disciplined weight of the musket fire. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington emerges from the flank with his light dragoons. His cavalry crashes into the side of the stunned British infantry formation. The militia circles back from the rear to strike the British lines. The trap snaps shut on the disorganized soldiers of the British Legion. Tarleton watches as his advantage evaporates into the smoke of the clearing. The British formation dissolves as the men attempt to escape the closing pincer. Morgan observes the tactical pivot point as his lines hold firm. The terrain of the Cowpens transforms into a graveyard for the British Legion. The order of battle successfully dismantles the strength of the attacking force. The British cavalry turns and flees the field to save their remaining numbers. The trap achieves its purpose through the precise execution of the 3-line defense. A leather-bound book sits open on a wooden desk. The gold-leaf lettering on the spine reads, "A History of the Campaigns of 1780 and 1781. Bannister Tarleton penned these words 6 years after the defeat at the Cowpens. He sought to reshape the memory of the January 17, 1781 disaster. The pages describe a force exhausted by a grueling night march. Tarleton claims his men arrived at the field in a state of physical collapse. He points to the fatigue of his infantry as the primary cause of the rout. The text shifts blame onto the subordinates who failed to maintain their lines. He characterizes the defeat as a misfortune of war rather than a tactical failure. A separate stack of yellowed parchment rests in a British archive. These documents form the official Cornwallis papers from the Southern Campaign. The ink details a different reality of the morning in South Carolina. British officer reports highlight a lack of reconnaissance before the engagement. They record that Tarleton committed his troops without waiting for his main infantry column. The documents show he ignored the clear signs of American preparation. He chose to charge the rise while his own men remained scattered. The records contradict his later claims regarding the readiness of his troops. They describe a commander driven by an impulsive, aggressive desire for glory. Tarleton disregarded the physical limits of his soldiers to force a quick victory. He pressed the attack despite the obvious exhaustion of his cavalry mounts. The Cornwallis papers confirm the total loss of the British Legion's light infantry. This loss stripped the British commander of his primary tactical eyes and ears. The discrepancy between the book and the archives reveals a defensive narrative. Tarleton attempted to salvage his reputation by rewriting the events of that day. He hid the reality of his own tactical impulsivity behind excuses of fatigue. His memoirs avoided the truth of the trap set by Daniel Morgan. The official reports instead provide a cold audit of the tactical errors. The British Legion dissolved because its commander ignored the reality of the field. The records serve as a silent witness to the arrogance of the British pursuit. The truth of the Cowpens remains locked in the contradiction of these documents. How did this failure force the British to abandon their heavy supply lines? Lord Cornwallis received the news of the Cowpens' defeat with visible shock. His primary mobile strike force vanished in a single morning. The loss of his light infantry stripped him of his ability to track the Continental Army. He stared at his maps inside his headquarters. He realized he could no longer afford the weight of his supply train. Cornwallis ordered his men to march to Ramsauer's mill. Soldiers piled crates of food and ammunition into massive mounds. They set torches to the wooden wagons. Dense black smoke rose above the North Carolina landscape. The entire British baggage train burned into ash and scrap metal. This desperate action aimed to restore the speed of his pursuit. He chased the American forces across the rain-soaked countryside. The soldiers slogged through mud that reached their knees. Men discarded their heavy coats to lighten their burdens. This grueling pursuit became known as the Race to the Dan. Nathanael Greene stayed just ahead of the British reach. He crossed the Dan River into the safety of Virginia. Cornwallis stopped at the riverbank with no boats to follow. His army lacked the supplies to sustain a longer campaign. He turned his exhausted troops back toward the interior. The British force marched toward Guilford Courthouse. They reached the site on March 15, 1781. The two armies collided in a brutal, inconclusive struggle. The British held the field but suffered irreparable losses. Cornwallis lost over a quarter of his remaining men. The tactical victory at the Cowpens set this collapse into motion. It fundamentally drained the British ability to control the southern colonies. The war shifted from a series of skirmishes to a war of attrition. The British Empire lost its grip on the Carolina backcountry. You now stand in the clearing where the trap was first set. The grass is silent, but the shadow of the encirclement remains. You feel the weight of the decisions that led to this ruin. The cycle of tactical arrogance never truly ended. It is only waiting for you to walk into the open.